Welcome, everyone, this evening to our important conversation about the movement for police-free schools. My name is Mark Warren. I'm a professor of public policy and public affairs at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and I am the lead author of the book, Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out, Voices from the Front Lines of the Educational Justice Movement. I'd like to thank Beacon Press for hosting this important conversation tonight, and I'd like to thank the other panelists who are going to talk about their important work that they're doing, organizing to remove and defund police from our public schools. With the rise of mass protests against police violence towards Black people, we have also seen the rise of this movement to defund and remove police from schools. I imagine that many people in the audience today perhaps did not realize the extent of the presence of armed police officers in our schools, and may have been taken by surprise that all of a sudden across the country, communities have been organizing and putting forward proposals with their allies to defund school police. This may have appeared to come out of nowhere to a lot of people, but in actual fact, these demands and the gains that have been won over the last few weeks are the result of years of organizing that have been happening by Black and Latinx parents, young people, communities, and their allies. That work, that kind of organizing is featured in this book. And we have some panelists tonight, some of whom are authors in that book, to talk about the organizing work that they've been doing to get us to this point, some of the recent victories and wins that we have been having, and some of the challenges that we are facing to create public schools that are really safe and supportive of all students, and do not rely on the repressive force of police officers. People may not be aware that in this country today, nearly half of all of our public schools are patrolled by police. Most of these schools are concentrated in schools serving low-income Black and brown students. 1.7 million students in this country attend schools with police, but no counselors. It's really part of a larger system of mass criminalization of Black and brown communities and the defunding of supportive and high quality education, and instead moving our schools to systems of command and control. So I just wanted to open with a few of those remarks. At this point, I would really like us to turn to a conversation about the movement to defund and remove police. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. Then each of them will have about 6 minutes or so to talk about the work that they've been doing to remove police from schools. What are some of the lessons that they have learned? And so we're going to start with Jonathan Stith. He's the National Director of the Alliance for Educational Justice, which has supported youth-led campaigns to remove police from schools for 10 years now. He's also an author of an essay in this book, which details that work. Then we're going to hear from Elsa Bañuelos. She is the Executive Director of Padres Jóvenes Unidos in Denver, which has led some of the earliest campaigns to limit police presence and arrests of students in schools, and recently won an end to school police in Denver. Then we're going to move to Monica Garcia, another author of an essay in this book. She's a member of the Los Angeles Unified School District Board of Education. And for many years, she has allied with parents and youth organizing groups to work for educational equity in the city. And she was a sponsor of the recently passed motion to cut the school police budget in Los Angeles by $25 million. And then to wrap up, we're going to hear from two youth organizers and leaders from the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council in Chicago. We have Veronica Rodriguez. She's a youth organizer who started organizing within their high school at age 16, founding a club called Student Voice Committee. They now help the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council's Police Free Schools campaign in Chicago. And we will also hear from Tania Trejo, a graduate of Curie Metro High School on the south side of Chicago. She's now attending the University of Illinois, and she has got involved through her Student Voice Committee and continues to fight to make sure all students have equitable resources and educational opportunities in Chicago. So let me turn this over now to Jonathan. Jonathan, take maybe 6 minutes or so to highlight some of the work that you have been involved with and some of your observations and lessons that you've been learning about the National Campaign for Police-Free Schools.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And thank you to Beacon House for having this discussion. Again, my name is Jonathan Stith. I am the National Director for the Alliance for Educational Justice. And AEJ is a national network of 30 youth-led and intergenerational groups that have been organizing since 2008 to end or dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. First, trying to make an intervention at the federal level. But then as we saw, we've been doing this work for a really long time. There have been many kind of moments where the demand for police-free schools was not articulated as a demand for police-free schools, but a call for police out of our schools. Dating back, I mean, as far back as as we talk about in the Reclaim the Learn report, as early back as the 1950s, and what we saw in Philadelphia, and students being attacked by the police chief Rizzo at the time, to some of the work that was coming out of California, youth organizers coming out of California in the early, late 80s and 90s. And this specifically for us, and I guess where we tie in with the chapter with the book is really at the assault at Spring Valley in 2015 with Shakar being dragged and body slammed by a school resource officer. And Nia Kinney, the high school student and classmate at the time, organizing what was an impromptu cop watch that then led to her being arrested, as well as Shakar for disturbing education. Again, it was a flash moment in our movement where we saw high school students, particularly Black youth, really moved by Shakar's story. They knew the story, they knew Nia's story, and were in to really figure out how they would defend Shakar and Nia winning, the charges being dropped, as well as making a commitment to build out a national campaign for police-free schools. And so part of the work, again, has been the march to get there. What we know and what feels really important to talk about in this moment is also kind of who are the young people organizing, what is their ideology, what do they believe in, what's the world that they're fighting for. To echo Ella Baker, this is bigger than Restorative Justice Circle, this is bigger than even police-free schools, as we've started to say that winning the end of contracting in schools, or ending the contract between school departments and schools, is just the beginning of struggle. It's not, it's in. And so when we say police-free schools, what we're talking about in the campaign is we're talking about the dismantling of school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization, surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. And so in that is an ideology of abolition, and young people in the campaign and the organizers in the campaign see themselves as abolitionists, and understand this work as part of a seeding of a much bigger vision. And so we understand abolition is not only as a practical tool and organizing strategy, but also a vision for a transformed world. And so young people's vision of police-free schools is grounded in that abolition ideology, this idea that we can organize for the future now, and that the wins that we are winning are seeds to much bigger societal changes. And so part of also what feels really important too is understanding also some of the context of what was happening before COVID happened, right? We were at the Alliance, we were tracking and doing rapid response work around what we call assault at. So 5 years later, after the assault at Spring Valley, we still continue to see the police brutality against Black students and students of color in schools. And at the time that schools closed because of COVID, we were documenting an assault at least once a week in a school in this country by a school police police resource officer. So what we understood was that the police violence was only escalating since 2015, and that, along with a series of kind of folks organizing for reforms to see those reforms be to fail, move many groups that you'll hear from Denver and other places towards a politic of calling for the complete dismantling and push of police out of schools. The second thing that we want to talk about is that, again, part of the strategy is that it's a multifaceted strategy. So many of the groups, although kind of ending the contract is one particular aspect of it, the de-dismantle strategy, we also understand that that policing presence in school is really pervasive. And we would draw that to what we've seen currently with the case of Grace, who was the middle school student in Michigan, who was arrested for not doing her homework online and during COVID. And so for us, one of the things that we are looking at and concerned about as schools continue to reopen, is that it's only reopening policing, and that under the kind of virtual learning, we're creating conditions where we are potentially inviting law enforcement and the racist violence that it brings into our homes, and that Grace is an example of that. And that's something that we need to really be on the lookout for, and really figure out how we adopt this strategies of how do we deprioritize police as an instrument of last resort or no resort at all. How do we continue to fight for the divestments that we saw in Los Angeles, and have those resources that we're using to police Black and Indigenous and young people of color be shifted towards their support and their development? How do we decriminalize the laws that make learning a crime in classrooms, particularly even again under COVID, as we're seeing again, are hearing stories of young people being criminalized right in their own homes. How do we continue to delegitimize the story around policing and safety and school shootings, all of which have been proven false? And what we've seen now with Trump and the use of federal police in response to Black protests for justice, the use of federal forces, we know how dangerous that is, particularly what we saw in Ferguson, and a lot of what we saw in the organizing of young people in LA through the Labor Community Strategy Center and their campaign around ending the 1033 program and getting that school police department to return its military grade weapons. So cooperation with federal forces in this moment, particularly when we understand young people have been a force in those protests, feel really important. And then our last D, which we're now moving to, is defend. So now we're seeing that with victories in Oakland, San Francisco, Madison, and Milwaukee, and Phoenix, that there is a continued pressure by police to continue to have a presence in schools. And so we need to be in a fight to not only win, but also defend police-free schools and really continue the march towards liberatory education. So I'll just stop right there and give breath and allow other folks to jump in. Excited again to be a part of this conversation. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Before we move to Elsa, I just want to remind folks who are attending in the audience that there is a Q&A function on your Zoom screen, and you are welcome to raise questions that you'd like us to address at any time. So you don't have to wait to the Q&A part. So if something comes up now, please go ahead and jump something into that Q&A. And then later on in the program, I hope we'll have an opportunity to engage with some of those questions. I also wanted to remind people that the Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out book is actually available now as a free, downloadable ebook on a Kindle on all platforms, thanks to the generosity of Beacon Press. So take this opportunity if you'd like to check out the essays by some of the people that you're hearing today, and the range of others in the book. So great. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Elsa from Padres Jóvenes Unidos.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jonathan, for that context, like that national context, because it's a lot of what we're doing in Denver. So my name is Elsa Bañuelos. I am the executive director here at Padres in Denver, Colorado. We have been around for almost 30 years, and Our founding member, Pam Martinez, actually wrote the chapter. I'm the first solo ED, so I'm really privileged and honored to continue the work that our founding members have started. So we have been working on discipline issues for over 20 years. We, at the time, did not have terms or terminology of what was happening to our Black and brown kids, but we knew that a lot of our kids were being pushed through harsh discipline policies, either through being arrested at school, ticketed, or expelled, or suspended. So when I came on as a youth organizer in 2003, and this is when we started to partner up with some national organizations like the Advancement Project out of DC, and we were doing research, participatory research, and I had the privilege to take some of our young people to the courthouses and talk to parents and young people to see why they were there. And that's when we saw the pattern that a lot of young people of color were being sent to the courthouse. People were shocked that it was like, is this like a real court? Like, is this a real ticket? It's like, yeah, they will get a warrant and get arrested. And if they do not have documents, they will be sent to the detention center and possibly processed for deportation. So we were able to, figure out what was going on in a track in Denver. And since then, we were pushing Denver Public School, which is one of the largest districts in Colorado, calling for really looking at this discipline matrix and model. And in 2008, we won the first kind of like discipline community-led, partnering up with the district's policy. We have 7 board members, and all 7 board members voted in favor of it. And since then, 4 years later, we had other districts. There's a total of 187 districts in Colorado. Folks were like, how do we do this? Can you come and do this? But as we know, this is a really it's a lot of work, and we just don't have the resources and capacity to do this. So we were like, data is what gave us a clear picture of what was happening. So we pushed for a state law in 2012, and we won it, requiring all school districts in Colorado to report any incidents with police by race and the actual incident date, those details. And just fast forward, we were having what we called accountability meetings with the district every year and really grading them. Our young people graded different pieces, components of the discipline policy, anywhere from like, how was restorative practice implemented, how many, looking at the data. There were still huge racial disparities. The number overall went down, but like Jonathan said, there was this peak around 2013, 2015, where we saw this huge peak of young people getting arrested again and being ticketed at higher rates. So it was really interesting because in Denver, we saw the numbers going down, but when we broke it out by race, our young people were being targeted at much higher than previously before we started to push the district for the discipline policy. And just, the district, and I'm sure that we're not the only district in the country, they're finding ways to really still push our kids into the prison system. We know that Denver is pretty much creating their own police department. We know that they have undercover cops. There's only a total, I'll get to it, but a total of 18 SROs, police officers in the district. But like Jonathan said, we're not just talking about the physical police. We're talking about the administration that feeds into the criminalization of our young people. We're talking about, there's a contradiction, our own people who are security guards, right? That they're being pushed to harass our own kids in their own neighborhood. So fast forward with the uplift, a lot of the awesome movements happening, we were able to just recently push for the removal of police, the 18 SROs and DPS. So beginning that conversation, so ending the contract between Denver Public Schools and the Denver Police Department. And kudos to AJ and AP for helping us. And also I just want to uplift having national we really need to have united front and really partnering up with other organizations across the country and networks like AEJ, because without them, we just can't leverage the support that we need. So I just like kudos to our partners nationally. So we won this. We're beginning to have the conversations and seeing what we're going to do with the 500K. It's not a lot. It's a win, but for us, it's like, it's the beginning of like a really hard conversation of like DPS. You need to like, this is just like the first layer. Like we need to start talking about like security. We need to talk about your discipline policy. Like, why are we still targeting our young Black and brown folks? And also just really looking at with this whole COVID, we're really anticipating increase of number, like high numbers of our kids being targeted. You know, there's still a lot of racial disparities in terms of like who has access to Wi-Fi, computers, and our kids are gonna get discipline if they don't check in at a certain amount of time or within a certain, you know, certain window. So we're gonna see a huge increase in that. So I don't have much time, but in terms of lessons learned, I think that overall, one lesson that I wanna share is that being consistent with your message and just calling it what it is. Like, this is like institutionalized racism. Like we, people would call us crazy, like racism doesn't exist. Like, you know, Black kids and brown kids are usually, you know, the whole like, they're poor and they have, you know, all these issues at home. So of course they're gonna be like, they're gonna have more discipline problems. We're like, no, that's not the problem. We're talking about like real racism. This is modernized like slavery. It's a way for you all to control us. So just being consistent with like calling it what it is. And that's, I think we've been able to be successful in winning what we won and getting people who align with us slowly, eventually, to that frame and that message. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elsa. I'm going to turn now to Monica Garcia. We've been hearing now from a couple of the organizers that have worked with young people and parents of color and communities. Now turning to Monica, who's a member of a board of education. So the movement has allies also on the inside and on boards of education. And so I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks on the work that you've been doing.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with all of you, and I'm grateful that there is a world that cares about young people and understands that we have to embrace the discomfort of suffering and pain that is in the neighborhood and make sure it arrives on the chair or table of leadership, making decisions on funding and policies. So I am a daughter of Mexican immigrants. I'm the third Latina in 155 years to be elected on the school board. Our school district is 91% kids of color and 82% kids of free and reduced lunch. And I just want to share that at the time of the book, my contribution was that change in LA is happening because we have an inside-outside strategy. So there was a community of organized young people in 2005 that showed up at LA Unified and said, we want rigorous curriculum, we want access to college-going culture, and we want A through G readiness. And that changed the world for me. It motivated me and inspired me to run for the school board. So I want to say that because this work requires the organizing on the ground and people to get involved politically. Make sure you register to vote. Make sure you are holding folks accountable. And I'm just going to say this, nothing in LA has changed without young people, leaders, putting themselves on the line to say, hey, something is wrong in my neighborhood and I need more help or I demand more services. What we are talking about now with defunding the school police is really a conversation that started when, 52 years ago when young people walked out of schools in LA, the East LA blowouts, and demanding access. So what our world looked like in June is we had pandemic, we have economic crisis. And then we had the protests for, yes, sparked by George Floyd, but it was sparked indeed by just decades and decades of under support across the board. And what I heard is not just the testimony. Yes, in LA, we have had young people organizing to build new schools, to get A through G for all, to get rid of the 1033 program, and to build a, today they call it the Blue Bridges program, conversations with law enforcement inside of school. But overall, what was most dramatic in June is that the social uprising called for all members of the community to embrace the need to put race and class at the center and to reach beyond what we were comfortable with. So in LA, safety is not negotiable. It is essential. But children had not been coming to school because our campuses are not safe because of public health reasons. They were left without services. Today, LA Unified has served 50 million meals from March 18th to today. But so our young people, again, in the streets, demanding investment, demanding support, demanding that instead of $70 million going to support the corrections strategy in Los Angeles and California, that we would take some of that money and demonstrate solidarity and the desire to support young people. I just want to say that there's many, many opinions, many testimonies, many people. I got over 10,000 emails on this subject, right? So there were 3 resolutions after the uprising. Two of my colleagues called for task forces. The superintendent had already established a task force. I said, over 3 years, let's transition the money. Put the money into support for kids. Reading and writing interrupts the harm of race, of institutional racism and classism for sure. So our responsibility as a school district, I saw it, I know school police officers are good people who are trying to do their job. My conversation with the public wasn't about where blame goes. It was about corrections versus education. And I will side with education each time. We didn't have the votes at the first resolution conversation, so no resolution passed after over 12 hours of public comment, but meaning we needed 4 votes in the affirmative. After that conversation, the next week was the budget action. And so my budget amendment, again, in support of our community, we redirected $25 million towards African-American students, mental health, pupil services counselors, more support. We didn't prescribe how, but we said, let's start today. Colleagues on the board were willing to do it this year, and so we embraced that. But we had thousands of people active. Over time, we have had cadre, the Dignities in Schools campaign, the Strategy Center, Community Coalition, Inner City Struggle, lots of organizing. But what we saw in June was, I believe, an extension of the civil rights movement that moves to make our country a more perfect union. We were not satisfied with the way things were. And so we always have to, or I believe, we got to vote for change. And there are conversations about what does that mean? How do we go forward? But right now we are at a moment where safety and safety for learning and safety for all must be understood at not just police out of schools, but the policing of young people. Whoever is doing that, however we are doing that. In the name of safety, institutions and adults allow for violations of well-being. And that's what I heard young people say. We need to rethink that. And I'm just gonna say that for the last 20 years, the discipline foundations, ending willful defiance, ending 1033. These are all community, student, parent-led efforts, sometimes with support from labor and other organized philanthropy, etc. But mostly it is the voice of the student that is the catalyst for change in our system. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Monica. So on that note of the role, and importance of the voice of students, let us turn to some of the youth organizers and youth leaders that we have with us tonight from the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council in Chicago. So I will turn it over to Veronica and Tanya.
Awesome. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be in this space to reflect on what brought me to this moment today. Thinking about how organizing for me began as a student, trying to figure out why there was this huge disconnect between my high school and our community. There was this need, or there is this need for support that students needed because they just suffered another loss of a friend. ICE kidnapped someone in their community. There's a shooting by their home, or that a student and their family is facing eviction. Real things that affect our safety and our lives, right? You're trying to do well in class, but you can't focus. You're antsy because you want to do something, but don't know where to start. And these are the same students who have police officers question them every morning, intimidate them for being late to class. These are the same students who have police officers roam their hallways, but don't have counselors and social workers, right? Like mentioned before, the conversations and the demand around police in schools began way before, and for us, for me specifically, began for me around 2017 or 2018, when students started learning about how much money the city of Chicago and Chicago public schools loves to put into Chicago Police Department's pockets. We were learning about the $95 million cop academy that former Mayor Rahm Emanuel was planning to build. And I remember this was also like around the same time that West Inglewood in Chicago was facing 4 school closures. And they were also planning to shut down National Teachers Academy, let alone like the mental health clinics that were shut down, and the 54 public schools that were shut down too in 2012 here in Chicago. So we were fired up, and there was just a lot of learning and visibility around kind of the divestment of our public neighborhood schools in our communities. And suddenly this plan for a $95 million cop academy in West Garfield Park was brought to light, right? And this plan is to continue to make our community suffer, right, from violence and poverty. And through this campaign, I learned a lot about the divestment of our communities, but most importantly, the violent role that police play in our communities, our schools, and the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So after the Chicago City Council voted 38-8 approving the, after approving the cop academy, the fight didn't end because young people like this was kind of a moment where we didn't want to stop because we had built so much momentum and people were asking, what's next? And so the conversations around how police officers in our schools are occupying and stealing our student resources began to expand. So we researched CPD and CPS and released a report, and we learned that more than 95% of police incidents in CPS involve students of color. We learned that even while police incidents overall have cut in half in the past decade, they continue to target Black students at 4 times the rate of white students in CPS. So to summarize, Chicago Public Schools is paying to have racist officers harass, intimidate, and arrest students of color. I'm gonna pass it on to Tanya now, who's gonna continue.
Thank you for having me. Sort of to go off what Vero said. So last year in 2019, a $33 million police contract with CPS was approved. And we attend their meetings, like their quote unquote public meetings. And we voiced our concerns, and those are the same concerns we're voicing today because nothing changed. the money does not belong to the police because they don't keep our students safe, they don't keep our community safe, and that money could be used now for like COVID-19 responses. I want to emphasize how like cops out of CPS, like our campaign is mainly it it's like more for youth, like the youth is leading these, and it's important to recognize that. And we've been active through social media and interacting and just providing resources for students, teachers, and community members. We have had workshops around the history of police and safety tools to prevent violence. We've led youth hearings where students share their experiences in schools, and they had like experts and talk about like similar similar issues like school to prison pipeline. We even showed up at the Board of Ed's president. His name is Miguel de Valles. We went to his house and we kind of just went outside to like show him how we're not going to give up and we're here. We're going to continue to voice our opinion. And we're going to like continue to do so. There's going to be another Board of Ed meeting to like vote on the $33 million contract, and we know that we're gonna win because like we've made it this far.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronica and Tanya. As you say, young people, Black and brown young people have been at the forefront of this movement, along with parents and community members. And so thank you for coming and speaking up and sharing your own views and your own words with us. We've been getting a number of questions in the Q&A. Please continue to ask them. I'm not sure we're going to answer all of them, but one of the questions that came up was one that I also did want to ask panelists, which is that some people believe, and certainly the police and others have argued, that police are really necessary to create safety in schools. And I wanted to ask what alternatives or how do you envision creating a safe and supportive school environments without police? What are some of the initiatives that you have taken or that you see happening around the country to, again, create school communities that are based on abolition, as Jonathan said, and create more libertary forms of education? I know there could be restorative justice alternatives and things like that. So does anybody want to say a few words?
So I can just share,
Sure.
if it's okay, I can share that we have principals and schools who were interested in creating pilots, that they would say relationship and personalization with their staff and students was the main element of creating safe campuses. Whenever our youth have worked to eliminate random wanding and the use of pepper spray. And when there was an issue on campus, usually a student would inform a trusted adult about a concern, and then there would be a response. So I understand the fear that exists, especially urban America. Our students are safer on school than in the streets of LA for sure. And it is rougher for them from home to school. And so we have to work with our city and other electeds on that. But I can tell you that I know principals and teachers would rather see the resources directed to support relationship, well-being, healing, and focus, instead of saying the safety is in one position. And so I know many parents, many people say we need more police because that's the frame that they're operating in some authority to come and be responsible. But in the liberation side of life, when we own self-determination and we accept that we are all responsible, then people really do begin to strengthen community so that there are different responses beyond arresting. And for LA, partly as we saw our probation system pay $233,000 a year. Once a kid gets in trouble, we'll do health, we'll do housing, we'll do food, we'll do education. But LA saw us go to, I mean, California, we went to $5,200 a kid for 180 days. So we have to understand that it's not the frame of there's abundant resources for every position. School districts do make choices about what they're investing in. And therefore, I would say the only way to deal with corrections is real learning about life and being human beings. And that can come in different ways.
Thank you. Great. Does anyone else want to say a little bit about their work in this area, or what they see as alternatives or ways to really promote safety and support in schools?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's such a huge conversation to be had around safety. What is safety? Who is safety for? And the role of police around that safety. And so what we're learning is that, you know, the police are, as we've heard from Chicago and Denver, that police are in schools to control Black, Indigenous, and young people of color and their behavior. For us, it is connected to the early fights or readjustment by the system around early victories that a lot of the groups here had around suspensions, where we were able to win ending suspensions. Again, what we saw in that research was that Black youth and other young people of color and oppressed youth are no more behaviorally different than the behavior of white students. They are disciplined differently. And that where they replace suspensions with police violence. And so instead of getting suspended, now you get beat up by a school resource officer, dragged downstairs, and tear gas. There's also so much research that suggests that what we understand as violent crime in schools is virtually non-existent. And so there's a way, again, that we have to understand how young people and Black and young people of color's behavior, their very behavior, is criminalized. And what we saw with the suspensions, right? Most of folks, and they, Monica can talk about this, in LA, a lot of young people were getting suspended for willful defiance, right? And a lot of times it was refusing a racist order or something crazy that young people were they were saying no to. They were on a lot of levels standing up for themselves. And what we've seen with the 140 assaults that we've been able to document, that each one of the assaults came as a result of a police officer being used to address routine student behavior, young people being late to school, getting slapped, young people trying to use an elevator and getting beat up and maced, young people in Philadelphia, and they saw at Ben Franklin, which is in the book, Brian was assaulted and choked out by a school resource officer for wanting to use the bathroom. So we just have to really debunk the racist narrative around our young people's behavior, and that they are criminals, and that they are even the problem that need, and on some levels in a liberal way, they need more counseling. Young people don't need more counseling. The adults need more counseling. They need to sign up for some anti-racist training to get their lives together and stop blaming Black youth and other youth for the problems and their inability to teach a racist curriculum.
Cool. Great, thanks. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to this issue.
I think just one last thing that I kind of want to add on to this conversation that has been helpful for me and kind of young people that I talk to is addressing violence, because when we've attended a lot of these local school council meetings advocating to remove the SROs from their schools, oftentimes we hear, but what about the violence that's happening outside of the schools? What about the and I think that's what's become so kind of difficult, because violence, we know that it's a symptom to something that's happening in their environment, in their community, right? And I feel like when we start having those conversations and ask these adults in power to look at the root causes, right? We know that sometimes it's poverty. We know that it's when people don't have housing. And I think opening that conversation and allowing young people to share those stories and actually be listened to, because that's what's happening. And that's something that we're noticing. Like, students are sharing their stories and their experiences, and these adults, like Board of Ed members, they simply created fake stories or said back in my day, which kind of just shows like how easily dismissed we are and how there is a need to like have these real conversations and to center young people. And I think that's a step that we can take towards talking about safety, right? Because we experience it, we live through this, right? And we're able to analyze like what we need and what our community needs.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Thanks. We're getting a number of questions in the Q&A box. It sounds like from people who are interested in doing something in their local communities about this and are asking questions like, well, how do we find out, even get some data on how many school police do we actually have in our schools? How much money is being spent on them? Is there sample language that we can find that would help us start to make some proposals? So, I'm shifting it slightly to a more, I don't know if this is more practical, but certainly a movement building approach. Are there some resources or some advice that any of the panelists would like to point those folks on the call or in attendance today who don't want to just learn about the police-free school movement, but want to actually become participants in it? And you can certainly answer that by words, and you can certainly put things in the Q&A box too, in terms of link to resources. So would someone like to say a couple words about the availability of data or sample proposals, things like that?
I am happy to share. In 2013, Jonathan's absolutely right. I remember a meeting with our superintendent, chief of police, and I was board president at the time, and the young people came in and said, I'm being suspended because I didn't bring a pencil. I'm being suspended because I was wearing a cap. And at first, they said, no, it doesn't happen, Monica. They went out and checked, and indeed, we got the chief of police and the superintendent on board with ending willful defiance, and today it is now California law, but that took several years. So I have a resolution, it's called the Student Climate Bill of Rights. Our discipline foundation policy is probably a little dated, but that's how we introduced restorative justice. That's how we actually created a task force to help district folks and community members come together and take a look at racial disproportionality of investment, achievement, and discipline. And so we did in 2013, we had 75,000 days lost to suspension, and now we're under 4,000 for sure. And so tracking the data does help. You can also look at your budget documents. In LA Unified, our budget shows us that 90% of the $70 million of the school police budget are people, right? And so today, when people are saying we want to save jobs, we have to say we're not against jobs. We just need to repurpose this money because the state of California isn't giving us more. So how's the money being spent? How many positions are there? What positions in salary and retirement or other benefits? What kind of money is being spent on supplies, whether that's ammunition, vests, whatever a police officer or SRO would use, but really helping show that it is the same pot of money. We don't get special safety pot of money. We get the same money to serve and educate all children. And then I think the other piece, so data, very, very important. When we could show that 8.6% of our population is African-American. However, on discipline, it's 26%. So the racial disproportionality that exists calls us all to accept why does this happen? And where does this happen? And why are there schools where it doesn't happen? And so what kind of support are we looking for? In LA, when we looked at the probation, in 2014, I learned that 42% of the kids incarcerated were LA Unified students. So we started making the connections of when we call law enforcement, what happens? When you call an administrator to help a student or child learn, when restorative justice gets kicked into place, that other system doesn't get activated. And that's the institutional racism and classism that we have to unpack for people. So we also got a judge to help us. We had a judge who said there's 1,200 cases in my courtroom that really should be about adults, but management of overcrowded schools led to behavior that wasn't a policy, it was a behavior. And even our school police, sometimes we had to really understand who calls them, because they were not being called at every school in the same way. Some healthier schools with healthier relationship had different ways of dealing with an explosion of energy or a bad choice, right? Helping young people learn how to use their words instead of violence, or use their words instead of the cyber energy. So I would just say, track your data over time, but I'm happy to share the resolutions we have put forward to help unpack that.
Thank you. Great. Anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. I think for us, we've done FOIA requests, like formal requests to get the data. But at the end of the day, it's really the pressure from community and holding districts accountable and shaming them publicly that they are not tracking the data. Like we said, we've been doing this for years, and the district has found ways to manipulate and rename certain categories. So when we ask for data, it looks like they are not, like they're like that there's no discipline issues at all. But we know based on like stories that we hear from people that there are issues. Sorry, my 7-year-olds are here. So we have had to find ways to figure out how they reframed it to be able to get the data that we need. Jonathan, I think you have more to add.
Yeah, and when we can come back to you. Jonathan, did you want to add?
I was gonna ask BPNC to talk about their work around FOIA requests and how they have been doing that, because I think Chicago is a really great example, because at one point they didn't know how many police officers they had in their schools, right? In addition to, I think there's some ways that we've seen groups and organizations get data. So you definitely want to get the arrest data and all the things that we heard from Elsa and Monica. The Black Organizing Project in Oakland, I think one of the things that they did really innovative was to look at the calls that were going to the police department, particularly if a school district has an arrangement with the school police. So how many times are they being called, and what are they being called for? And for Oakland, they found out that the Oakland school system was calling the police 6,000 times a year on Black students. And so being able to, again, to use that data to really raise the question of race feels really important, and something that I would encourage all communities to do. But I'm gonna shut up and ask BPNC talk about the FOIA requests.
And FOIA meaning the Freedom of Information Act request, for those who don't know. Yes, great. Veronica, Tanya, do you want to say something about that?
You want me to go, Tanya? Yeah. So we did a lot of FOIA. We have core youth who really focused on making sure that their summer was spent by learning how to FOIA and how to teach other young people to FOIA, which was super awesome, because through this we were able to FOIA the school officers in these schools. And with that information, students who were interested in learning how to organize or initiate some sort of organizing in their school, use that as an opportunity to kind of leverage themselves and show like how CPD purposefully gets cops who have like these complaints, these misconducts as a consequence for their behavior to be put into our schools, right? So we had that leverage and we had that information. Surprisingly, not really. Some schools don't take that into consideration. And it is scary, right? For some parents to realize that the police officers in their children's schools have caused some sort of harm. So it is helpful sometimes. But I put it on the chat, but our Cops.cps website, we published a report where we made sure to FOIA, and it was we got a lot of data regarding a lot of the complaints So for example, the 180 school resource officers and 21 school liaison supervisors assigned to CPS have a combined total of at least 2,354 misconduct complaint records on file against them. We learned through this FOIA that if we allocated the $33 million currently given to the 180 SROs and CPS, could fund positions for 317 social workers, 314 school psychologists, or 322 nurses. So once again, when we have data, like, it's stronger in our favor, right?
Cool, great. Elsa, I know you got a little cut off possibly. Did you want to say anything more about this issue?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Just again, just to be persistent in with the data and just making sure that just calling them out. I mean, just they're finding ways, like I said, to recategorize a lot of the stuff. And even when we sent FOIA requests to the police department, it's like, you know, we don't have anything under that name or whatever. So just really making sure that we're persistent and have a large base to be able to hold these institutions accountable and shaming them publicly.
Great. So I know we have a couple minutes left. It's been a great conversation. I want to mention two things, and then I'm going to give everybody a quick sort of 20 seconds for final comment. First of all, there was a question about recording of this event tonight. It is going to be made available. It is being recorded. It will be made available on the Beacon Press's YouTube page and in a follow-up email. Secondly, to remind people that the Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out book is available for free through the end of this month as a Kindle or ebook, and you can find that information also in that follow-up email. And finally, I guess my last question, we only have really a minute, so if any parting thoughts about, you know, we're in quite a moment right now in this country, a moment of crisis, but also a moment of opportunity. I know many of us have been organizing and fighting for a long time to put systemic racism front and center, to challenge this country to address it. And we're in a moment when this seems to be at least raised in consciousness. So any final thoughts about where we're going, what needs to happen to really make the mass protests turn into really systemic change and institutional change in public education, but also in our larger society? So last thoughts on that big question.
3 things. So remember to register to vote and get people out to vote. You need the people. We got less than 90 days, friends. Number 2, you need to be present in your board meetings, by email, by phone call, however you're organizing your own friends to make a call. It is a habit. And number 3, find the allies in your school. Teachers, janitors, cafeteria lady, there are adults who want to be allies.
Thanks, great. Anyone else want to jump in with couple quick points?
Yeah, my three is always organize, organize, organize. As we've seen in this moment, that these up moments can only really be seized if we are organizing before, during, and after these moments of social unrest and uprising. And so I encourage folks to get involved in the fight. Follow us, the fight on, we dropped the website, but it's policefreeschools.org. Download the report, wecametolearn.com. Follow us online at the number 4 Ed Justice, both on Facebook and Twitter, and follow the hashtag Police Free Schools and hit us up. We are open to trying to support groups to continue to fight and win, and lifting up so much energy to groups in Chicago who are still bopping, as well as Philadelphia and DC, New York, Charleston, Columbia, South Carolina, and then Providence, Rhode Island, and then the many more school districts that have made this decision that we don't know about. We want to be in struggle together, and because we believe that we can win together.
Great. All right, I'm going to close us on that note. I want to thank all the panelists and Beacon Press and everybody who's joined this conversation. and urge everyone to organize and continue that fight for police-free schools. So thank you.